There are things we can learn in terms of wisdom from all the experiences that our world and humanity have gone through. In other words, we can't just ignore something simply because it was produced by people who aren't like us or don't share our beliefs. On the contrary, if there is something good or true in it, and it doesn't conflict with our core beliefs, we can also adopt it. We can incorporate it into our own culture. When they proposed that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there should be a separate region for the Serbs, a separate region for the Muslims, and a separate region for the Croats, Alija Izetbegovic said, "We will continue to fight against this." He said, "We want to live together." Because living together means keeping each other alive. And one of the most important examples of this in the world is still the experience of Islamic cities. If you go to Bosnia and Herzegovina today, you'll see that some mosque minarets have been left standing. They are in ruins, with their tops destroyed, but in the villages and cities, churches and mosques stand side by side. Because they live together, you won't see any damaged churches.
Hello to everyone from the Istanbul School. Dear viewers, today we will be talking about the late Alija Izetbegovic, an important figure in our intellectual world. Our guest is Professor Dr. Mahmut Hakkı Akın. Welcome, Professor.
Hi, thanks.
How are you?
Thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much, Professor. Today, we would like to talk with you about Alija Izetbegovic, specifically in the context of his works. He has an important work called Islam Between East and West. Let's call it his masterpiece. If you like, let's start with this book. How would you evaluate it? What do you think?
Islam Between East and West is, as you mentioned, Alija Izetbegovic's masterpiece. It's a book where all his thoughts and accumulated knowledge come together. This book was published in 1984. In other words, it was published when Alija Izetbegovic was 59 years old. So they ask him as well, "When did you write it?" Saying. And Alija Izetbegovic gives an interesting answer. Since it's a book focused on thought and philosophy, people might expect that it took him 3 years, 4 years, or even 10 years to write it. To the journalist who asked, the late Izetbegovic says, "Since my high school years." And that's really how it is. In other words, he combined the notes he took starting from his high school years, the notes from his readings, and his thoughts, blending all of these together, and wrote the book Islam Between East and West over a very long period of time. The significance of this book is this: in a world that was truly bipolar, divided into the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, the book's preface can actually be described as a call to Muslims, telling them that this world will change and that Muslims should once again take up their rightful role in history. That's how the late Izetbegovic puts it. In other words, it's a call about how Muslims can once again become key players in the changing course of history. Islam Between East and West is built on dichotomies. That's also how Izetbegovic understands things. He even has a statement about this. He says that, up until now, there have only been 3 worldviews in the world. No more than that. These are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Judaism is associated with materialism and worldliness. Christianity is associated with spirituality and the hereafter. Islam, on the other hand, follows a both-and logic. In other words, it accepts both this world and the afterlife. For humans, both body and soul. In other words, it is a mindset, an attitude, and a religion that unites these dichotomies, often seen as opposites, and it is also a direct practice and worldview. According to Alija Izetbegovic, Islam Between East and West is truly a very valuable work. Let me also say that, since it serves as a call to Islamic thought and Muslim societies in the 20th century, it is a very important contribution. So, for that reason, I also recommend it to the viewers. Reading Alija Izetbegovic's book, Islam Between East and West, can add a lot to a person.
Professor, what was Alija Izetbegovic's approach to achieving unity in Muslim societies?
Yes, now, Alija Izetbegovic was, of course, a Muslim scholar. He viewed the world from an Islamic worldview. In other words, he accepted Islam both as an intellectual foundation and as a way of life that he personally practiced. His views also developed in a way that was consistent with Islam. When Alija Izetbegovic looked at Muslim societies, he saw a state of contradiction. According to Izetbegovic, there is a crisis and turmoil in Muslim societies, and at the root of this crisis lies a moral crisis. Izetbegovic describes it as follows. In other words, there is now a distance between Islam and Muslims. In fact, he has an aphoristic way of expressing this. He says, Islam is beautiful, but where do we stand in relation to it? Where are we as Muslims? Because there has been a change and a problem has emerged in the practices of Muslims and in the way they relate to the world. If you don't live according to the teachings and the religion you believe in, as it commands, a void emerges. That's where the contradiction comes from, and that's also where the crisis originates. Alija Izetbegovic tries to analyze this, and when he looks at Muslim societies, he asks the following question. In fact, this is a question that has been asked since the 19th century. As you know, questions like, is Islam an obstacle to progress? Or, why have Muslim societies fallen behind? These are questions that have been asked since the 19th century. Especially from the second half of the 20th century onward, during the period when Alija Izetbegovic became more active, meaning from the 1960s, when he started writing, publishing magazines, and producing works, the late Izetbegovic observed a division within Muslim societies. On one side of this division are the Zapadnik, whom he describes as people who are in conflict with their own traditional values. There are types who have become alienated from their own societies, their own traditions, and their own religion, and who have mostly adopted a positivist mindset, imitating the West. On the other side, there are religious groups and a traditionalist attitude that oppose everything new, experience Islam more as a cultural element, and repeat things simply because they existed in the past, without questioning what they really are, and are not very inclined to adapt to a changing world, while also appearing more devout. Alija Izetbegovic calls these people conservatives. However, he says that these two groups represent a polarization, a cultural divide, that they will not be able to understand each other, and at the same time, that they will not have any role in building the future of Muslim societies. That's why Alija Izetbegovic's call is for someone who also knows the new, who knows the West. In fact, he himself could be considered an expert in Western philosophy. In fact, he was even offered to have his book, Islam Between East and West, accepted as a doctoral thesis in philosophy. He truly has a deep command of Western philosophy and is, in many ways, a Western man. In a way, when you look at it as someone from Bosnia and Herzegovina, he is influenced by Europe. But on the other hand, he is not someone who completely approves of everything about the West and the changes in Western civilization. He is well aware of its contradictions, and also very much aware of its human crisis. And at the same time, Alija Izetbegovic possesses a profound culture of revelation. We can see from his writings that he closely followed the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. His practical life was also very simple. He truly lived with a simplicity that could serve as an example, and he was a humble person with qualities like modesty. Therefore, he desires the emergence of a type of person who is educated, aware of their era, but whose compass is firmly rooted in Islam. He says that this type of person has not yet fully emerged, which might be worth noting. In other words, it closely resembles what Mehmet Akif called the sim, so it is very similar to the Asim typology.
So, Professor, What was Izetbegovic's proposed solution to the conflict between tradition and modernity here? You mentioned an observation here. Was there a suggested solution for this? What was it?
Yes, first of all, the main issue Izetbegovic presents as a solution is the matter of education. In other words, Muslim societies need to be educated first and foremost. You also need to be educated in order to be strong. Let's say, just being rich from underground resources like oil, or being wealthy through other kinds of trade, doesn't make you strong. At the same time, you need to have a wealth of knowledge. Knowing something isn't just about repeating things. For example, if we believe the world is in a state of crisis, if we say the world has become a problematic place, and if we identify this state of turmoil not just for Muslims, but also for people in the West, people in the East, for capitalists, and for socialists, then what alternative are we offering? According to Alija Izetbegovic, what's needed is the development of a type of person who is aware of all these issues and can offer alternatives. That's why education is extremely important. He says that in a significant part of Muslim societies, freedom is a very serious issue. However, the foundation of morality is freedom. He says that a person who is not free cannot be a Muslim either. For that reason, Izetbegovic also says that certain established institutions and traditional elements need to be questioned. So in this sense, his ideas have made some people uncomfortable. But these are just ideas. Let me make that clear. They were not meant to provoke. Alija Izetbegovic is also someone who pays great attention to his manners, and I especially want to emphasize that. Because people can have different opinions, ideas. He also made his own interpretations based on his era, his circumstances, and his experiences. So, of course, it's not like Alija Izetbegovic's words are above criticism or anything. But what Alija Izetbegovic sees here is this. In other words, Muslim societies need to go through a process of re-Islamization. A process that values education and knowledge, is based on freedom and morality, and also addresses the alienation in the world. By the way, I mean human alienation. In other words, he identified and stated in his own time that we need to put a stop to this trajectory that will strip us of our humanity, take away our moral agency, and turn us into slaves of existing systems. And he says that it is not only that Muslims should do this, but that they must be the ones to do it. But let me point out one more thing. When he was imprisoned for the first time in 1946, sentenced by the communist regime as a member of the Young Muslims organization, Alija Izetbegovic said at that time, communism will most likely collapse by the end of this century. He also said that by the end of this century, Islam would once again become an alternative in the world, and at that time he was only 21 years old. He made such a prediction. Now, years later, when he was president, either at the Organization of Islamic Conference or while giving a speech somewhere, he said, "I was right about one thing." In other words, communism collapsed. Because communism was a regime that was against human nature. That's why it was bound to collapse. But he says, "I was wrong in my prediction that Islam would once again become an alternative for the world." Why was I wrong? Because Muslims still haven't made that move, and he comments that this remains a responsibility that awaits them in history.
Well, you talked about your ideas on education and awareness. Sir, what kind of model was he proposing here? If we elaborate a bit, what were his suggestions regarding education? Did he adopt or recommend an Islamic education? What is it exactly?
Well, as you know, there is certainly a saying of our Prophet. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he should take it. There are things we can gain in terms of wisdom from all the experiences that the world and humanity have gone through. In other words, we can't just ignore something by saying it was produced by people who aren't like us or don't believe as we do. On the contrary, if there is something good in it, if there is something true in it, and if it doesn't conflict with our core beliefs, we can also adopt it. We can incorporate it into our own culture. This is also the perspective of Alija Izetbegovic. because he himself ultimately received a Western-style education. But the Young Muslims organization is very important. While still in high school, Alija Izetbegovic would read books together with his peers there, some of them high school students, others university students or graduates. They were trying to become aware of the world. They were trying to understand how the world system works and to become aware of different ideologies. I'm talking about the 1940s. In other words, during the years of World War II, they believed it was necessary to know several foreign languages. And it's not about repeating something. Look, it's not a scholastic way of thinking, but a dynamic, critical way of thinking. Alija Izetbegovic placed great importance on critical thinking, but he also made another point. In the notes he kept while in prison, he wrote the following statement. He says, "If it were up to me, I would add a critical thinking course to all Muslim schools in the East." Unfortunately, he says, the East has not gone through this ruthless school, and this is the source of many of its weaknesses. He has a critical perspective. Because if we truly don't have a critical perspective, we can't question the situation we're in. We either accept it or react to it. We react without offering alternatives. The things that Alija Izetbegovic especially emphasizes regarding education and raising awareness are, first, questioning the current situation, and second, adopting what is good, taking in things related to wisdom. But on the other hand, of course, it is also about producing new alternatives without losing an Islamic stance. Here, when it comes to children's education, again, women receiving education is important. Back then, literacy rates were much, much lower. And this is something that concerns everyone as a whole, because, as you know, morality is not something that belongs to a specific gender. God Almighty did not send down separate morals for men and separate morals for women. It is the same in the example set by the Prophet. So here, we need to realize that concepts like morality and freedom are much broader and deeper. But he also mentioned here that we need to question our own situation as well. In fact, Alija Izetbegovic provides statistics about this in his book, The Islamic Declaration. One of the main problems and weaknesses we face is the issue of lack of education. But when we talk about Islamic education, we don't mean just any kind of Islamic education. For example, let me tell you the title of one of his articles. Are we raising Muslims or are we raising subjects? He says that most religious groups and organizations here are more concerned with raising subjects. They want people to obey them directly, not question anything, and just accept whatever they are given. He is completely against this. On the contrary, we should aim to raise free, dynamic, and moral individuals. Existing structures, existing institutions, because these are not indispensable. They can be criticized. But according to what are they being criticized? Of course, we should also be open to criticism within a proper and systematic framework, so there is this kind of critical perspective.
So, Professor, how did Alija Izetbegovic's leadership serve as an example for overcoming cultural divisions?
Yes, I think this is also an important issue. Because Alija Izetbegovic was not just someone who wrote books and articles and produced ideas.
He also had a practical impact.
He was also the president. As you know, he served as president of Bosnia and Herzegovina for 10 years. Of course, a large part of this was during the war and post-war conditions, meaning it was an extraordinary period. That also needs to be taken into consideration. But he was someone who lived simply. Above all, he lived according to his beliefs. On this matter, no one, not even his enemies, would be unfair to Alija Izetbegovic. I think this is important, because one of the biggest problems we see in Muslim societies is that there are so many contradictions in this regard. In other words, people are not as they believe or as they say they are. Because being true to oneself is extremely important. That's the first point. Another thing is that, although some black propaganda has been carried out against Alija Izetbegovic in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alija Izetbegovic was never after establishing a regime like the one in Iran or Saudi Arabia. Because, referencing the fact that he was both an Islamist and an intellectual, people have always said things like, this man is going to declare Sharia here, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. And he himself says this as well. In my opinion, this is also what he understood from Islam. He pursued a society where Croats, Serbs, Bosniaks, and other groups could live freely as themselves, just as they wished, and where the richness of living together was created. This is interesting, and he fought for it. At one point during the war, there was a proposal to give the Serbs a separate region within Bosnia and Herzegovina, because they were living together. When they suggested that there should be a separate region for Serbs, a separate region for Muslims, and a separate region for Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alija Izetbegovic said, "We will continue to fight against this." He said, "We want to live together, because living together means keeping each other alive." And one of the most important examples of this in the world is still the Islamic city experience. The Islamic city experience doesn't just allow Muslims to thrive, it is also a place where non-Muslims, considered as people under God's protection, can live safely. Alija Izetbegovic is very clear on this matter.
Aha. You spoke about this in the context of his leadership. At the same time, when we look at Alija Izetbegovic's tolerance and multiculturalism, what kind of example did he set for Muslims? So, when you look at it in the context of his Muslim identity, how do you see it?
Well, let me tell you two stories related to this. 1. In 1983, he was tried in what is known as the Sarajevo case, or the Sarajevo process, for publishing his book, The Islamic Declaration, in 1970. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison for the crime of attempting to divide Yugoslavia. Other Muslim thinkers, opinion leaders, and academics were also tried and sentenced. Later on, he was released from prison in 1988. He didn't serve the full 14 years. He was released from prison in 1988. He served 5.5 years, and in 1990 he became president. Now think about it, there wasn't even a year and a half in between. He was released at the end of 1988. When he became president, journalists asked Izetbegovic this question. They said, the prosecutor, the judge, and all those who unjustly put you in prison are still in their positions. What are you going to do about it? So, are you going to take revenge? Are you going to get back at them? No, he said. Alija Izetbegovic was already a grandfather when he went to prison. He was an older man. As for them, he said, as a person, I do not forgive them, but as the president, I do, he said. That's really beautiful. That's one thing. Because as a person, there was a real tragedy inflicted on his family and children. I mean, he spent a very long time in prison at that age. Another thing, in my opinion, is this, and it's also a good example. He has another aphoristic saying that's sometimes shared on social media and such. Our enemies are not our teachers, he said. That comes from a particular incident. War, of course, is an extraordinary time. Over 900 mosques were destroyed or damaged during the war. Over 900 were, burned down. The Croats, unfortunately, were especially burning down the mosques. But there wasn't a single church that was damaged. Just one. I mean, as far as I know, in the heat of the war, there was news that a Muslim artillery officer turned his cannon and damaged a church. Alija Izetbegovic punished those soldiers. In other words, they are not our teachers. If you go to Bosnia and Herzegovina today, you'll see that in some mosques, only the minarets have been left standing. They're in ruins, with the tops destroyed. But in the villages and cities, churches and mosques stand side by side. Because they live together, you won't see any damaged churches.
Both are wonderful examples, Professor. And he was also a politician. He demonstrated this balance in the context of both ethics and politics. So, how do you evaluate this? How do you think he manages to maintain this balance here?
You know, politics and ethics have always been considered as subjects in tension with each other. From the very beginning, even in classical texts, we see discussions about politics power, and especially what will limit authority. We keep reading debates about this topic. There is an ethical tension here in itself. Of course, this is something that Alija Izetbegovic both reflected on and, on the other hand, he was also a political party leader and a president during an extraordinary period. Alija Izetbegovic was someone who experienced all of this firsthand. Now, his wisdom comes long before his political side. That needs to be established from the very beginning. In other words, Alija Izetbegovic was not a man who sacrificed his morals just because he came into power. This is a very interesting thing. That was actually what first impressed me during my university years. At that time, his speeches were published. I mean, before the war started, when the Republic was first being established in Bosnia and Herzegovina. First it was a federation, and then the process where they declared their own independence. Then came the wars, and the speeches he gave during the war. I was really struck by this. Even in the speeches he gave during the war, he always based them on not straying from principles. There is a party speech he gave. The title of one of his latest books, which is also a collection of his speeches, was "We Will Not Be Slaves." We will not be slaves, but why won't we be slaves? We will obey the laws, we will follow the principles. Just because we have gained power doesn't mean we can use that power without limits. In fact, that's his saying. There's a phrase like, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so on. He talks about the corrupting nature of power, saying that power always has a corrupting force. To be able to resist it, he emphasizes the fear of God. He says that only a morality based on the fear of God can resist this. I see you applying this, in your own life too. In other words, Alija Izetbegovic is a man who has earned the respect of even his enemies. How did he earn the respect of his enemies? First of all, by adhering to principles during the war. Look, the people who fought against him started the war saying, "We won't leave a single Muslim here," because they lost the balance between morality and politics. He said exactly the opposite. He said, "I will make sure that even those who are not like me can live here." Look, one person is fighting for an ideal, while the other is fighting for something else. Let's say, living for their own primitive desires. Living for their hatred, for their revenge. There was nothing like that in Izetbegovic. Here, we see that he established the relationship between politics and morality in a very balanced way. And I would also like to refer to this, since it's related. In Islam Between East and West, when Alija Izetbegovic was asked about it, he even said, "Maybe my contribution to the history of thought could be this conceptualization. Drama and utopia." Now, when it comes to drama and utopia, as you know, utopias are visions of an ideal society. But in these visions of an ideal society, utopias actually try to answer the question of how to eliminate evil. And they at least idealize a social structure where goodness prevails. According to Alija Izetbegovic, most totalitarian regimes have their roots in utopias, because they have a single idea of what is good and they impose it on all societies. Well, on the surface, this seems good to those who think in a fascist way or have a totalitarian mindset. How nice, as if all problems will be solved when everyone thinks the same way. No, Izetbegovic also says that this goes against human reality. The fact that people are different and think differently is simply a result of being human. He says this in opposition to utopia, and there can be no utopia on earth. You cannot create a paradise on earth. Never. Because when you try to create paradise on earth, you'll end up having to exclude those who aren't like you. Alija Izetbegovic specifically points out that the Eastern Bloc countries, let's include the Nazis before them as well, tried to impose a utopia on the world, especially after World War II, and he clearly and firmly opposed this. He says this place cannot be a utopia, but at the same time, he acknowledges we have taken on a certain responsibility. All right, the world won't become a paradise on earth, that's a given, but the world can become a better place. and we have to fight for that. He says that this is only possible if politics and power are limited by morality. And when talking about him, we shouldn't forget the kind of person we're talking about. Alija Izetbegovic is someone who resigned from the presidency, and in his book, My Testimony to History, he explains one of the reasons for his resignation from the presidency as follows: I did not want to die as a president. This is also very important.
Yes, that was a beautiful ending, Professor. Truly, just like all the anecdotes you mentioned. And this also showed just how valuable a person he was. Thank you very much for your valuable insights. We talked about a wise scholar whose life and teachings can't be summed up just by talking about him. Let's open a door for our viewers as well, so they can read and benefit from his other books. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, today we talked about the great wise scholar Alija Izetbegovic. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.